Everyone, I hope that you've had a good JP Morgan Resi so far. I think the weather is holding off for the moment. It's not quite has reached the epic proportions we had last year. So I'm very pleased to be bringing you a big pharma panel today, and I have an excellent set of panelists, which means I don't have to do much talking, which is always my favorite way to moderate. We'll start off with some introductions, and then I'd actually like to take a little poll of who's in the room to make sure that we're steering the conversation in the right way. So I'm Chris Haskell. I run Bayer's West Coast Innovation Center, which is a small research and partnering site here in Mission Bay, just about a mile south of here. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their companies, their focus areas, and also add in a way that partnering for them has evolved in the last 5 years, something they're doing maybe a little bit differently that might be relevant for the early investor. Start the far end?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Niels Emmerich from AbbVie. I'm heading Search and Evaluation globally across therapeutic areas at AbbVie, with the main therapeutic areas for us being neurosciences, immunology, and oncology, with additional activity in areas like cystic fibrosis, women's health, and virology. And so my group, roughly 20 people, are responsible for identifying and assessing opportunities, and then work closely with our more transaction-focused colleagues in BD&A on getting the deals in place all the way until the finish line. What really has changed, I think there are two aspects to it from my point of view. One is AbbVie specific, and the other one is a general observation. I'll start with AbbVie. 6 years ago, it's now our 6th anniversary as an independent pure-play pharma company. The deal activity was comparably low compared to our peers in the industry. And since then, we've become one of the most active deal makers in the industry. Last year, we had 14 transactions, 5 venture investments, 9 BD transactions, 8 out of 9 in our core areas. And one more general observation is that deal making has sneaked into earlier and earlier stages. The majority of deals that we do and that our peers do are not for clinical stage assets with proof of concept. They're not for clinical stage assets prior to proof of concept. Therefore, preclinical and discovery stage opportunities. From the deal structure point of view, I think things that have changed is we see more option deals, we see more deals where companies hold on to, biotech companies hold on to commercial rights in certain territories. In this place here, mostly related to the US, and I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Jessica.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jessica Droge. I work at Amgen. I head up search and evaluation efforts globally for Amgen. Similar to Niels, we actually have a small group. It's a little bit smaller than Niels' group. It's about 12 people overall that look at everything from technologies, platforms, all the way to early stage preclinical deals, as well as post-market commercial opportunities and collaborations. Our areas of focus right now, the key areas are obviously oncology, immuno-oncology, autoimmune disease and inflammation. We're also very interested in cardiovascular. We have the Repatha, and we have several pipeline cardiovascular assets coming up. And also very interested in neuroscience. It's an incredibly challenging area, but we are looking for disease-modifying opportunities for neurodegeneration and also pain/migraine. Other areas that we're interested in, just because we have built expertise in the area and we're looking for great opportunities in that space, is nephrology as well as bone, since we have an osteoporosis franchise. So in terms of changes from 5 years ago, I think that we are actually seeing a lot of change as normal in the payer landscape, and that with the, I think, very expensive prices that we're seeing right now and expectations, it's been making the opportunities where our threshold is actually very focused on very differentiated opportunities. We're looking for compelling opportunities that will make a big difference with patients, that will stand out to payers and get reimbursed. And so we can bring things to market that are really worthwhile and put our investment there. We're also moving early too, as a counterbalance to that, and looking at platforms that make a difference in terms of being able to create treatments that either can get to targets that can't be interdicted with current modalities, or other opportunities to build a platform around compounds that can make target engagement easier, or also make patient compliance easier.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Kim Hollander with Merck & Company. Merck is a global human health pharmaceutical company, as well as large efforts in animal health and vaccines. I'm an executive director in the search and evaluation area for Merck Research Laboratories, where I oversee a group that's focused on enabling technologies. So our business development group has a very large effort based around the world in a hub format that searches and evaluates for new assets, therapeutics, vaccines. But my team actually is focused on enabling technology supporting all of our functional areas, including areas such as chemistry, pharmacology, drug delivery, vaccine and biologics technology, biomarkers, and companion diagnostics and diagnostics. Merck's focused areas are, as it's been for years, focused on vaccines, neuroscience, cardiometabolic. We have obviously very strong efforts in oncology and IO with our Keytruda franchise, and continue to look for science and assets that have an advantage over current therapies. So what's different from 5 years ago? You know, I think my colleagues so far have stated many of the obvious, but things are definitely moving much earlier, which means, you know, coming with better and strong data packages where you can. Later assets are harder to find given the numbers. From the technology side, looking for platforms that, you know, again, come with good proof of concept and can be used in areas that, you know, fill needs within our functional areas.
Well, good morning. I'm Chris Church. I'm based at MedImmune Cambridge site in the United Kingdom, and we're solely owned by AstraZeneca. So we're the biologics arm of AstraZeneca, and our major areas of interest are oncology, cardiovascular, renal, and metabolic disease, together with respiratory. And last year we spun out our inflammation and autoimmunity into a Viela Biotech, which came out of MedImmune. So as part of my role within partner and strategy, we have a team of approximately 10 spread across the UK and in Gaithersburg in the US and the East Coast. But we work closely with our AstraZeneca colleagues who are based globally within the business development unit. As part of my role, I look after and help coordinate early stage up to phase 2 A/B, bringing in licensing or externalization for cardiovascular, renal, and metabolic disease. And if we look at some of the changes within the last 5 years, something that I've noted in the last year is the increasing pace in the digital space and how we apply that both pre-clinically and our clinical trials. And it creates a different type of licensing in terms that we would have had with classical therapeutics. So that's evolving very quickly for us.
Thanks, Chris. So a little bit more about Bayer. Bayer's a little over 150 years old. Our current focus is in oncology and cardiovascular disease. And we're not in so much metabolic diseases, but in both respiratory, kidney, and traditional heart health diseases. We also have some research areas in ophthalmology and women's health. My function here, we support both the early innovation and access why Resi is so good. It's access to emerging innovators, as well as do alliance management. And so we'll stay with the program for years, even as we advance into the clinic. I think the trend on emerging early innovation and pharma companies getting involved earlier is very true. About 6 years ago, we started our collaborator model, which is an incubator for startups. We have 5 of them around the world. I think we're the second largest pharma-sponsored incubator network in the world. I think I can say that. But it's been great because we have 14 companies here in San Francisco. We've built very close relationships, and especially around platform technologies. It allows us to experiment with them and do even sponsored research and find ways to build common value with the companies. It's been very successful. We don't have a venture arm, which is another way some companies do this. So before I kick into the questions, I'm going to take a poll of the audience. You can either be large publicly traded, venture-backed, or pre-venture. So those are the three or other, here for the breakfast is the fourth category. So how many people in the room are large pharma or publicly traded, shall we say? Okay, small handful. I think two of them from my company. Thanks for coming. Okay, how about venture-backed? Okay, again, and then pre-venture, okay, so Resi's has their target audience, and then other. We're just too shy. Okay, so yeah, so that's most of the groups here are pre-funded companies, and they're probably here because they're looking at us as potential partners. So, in talking with the panelists, we were, and also the organizers here, what we thought we would try to do is make this very practical. And you heard in the introductions here an amazing Byzantine set of structures we have in our organizations. You know, technologies are here, BDNL is there. And so one of the big questions that often comes up is, what are the do's and don'ts when you're trying to get in the door, right? So some people just get the email address, they figure out our secret code, they email everyone from the CEO down, which is a no. That is not it. What you get is, then I get an email from the CEO saying, fix this problem. So you're starting off on the wrong foot. But why don't I let any of the panelists weigh in on the best ways to make that first introduction and how to make a good impression.
Maybe I'll start, and I think conferences like this, JPM, Bio, are great places to reach out and try to meet with us, but that always doesn't, or that often doesn't work due to time constraints. So, you know, the business development groups usually have folks that are focused in particular areas. On our website, for sure, sending your introductory emails, your package of non-confidential information to those folks gets it to the right place, or someone in the BD organization. I would agree with Chris, when we get 15 emails from a company scattered across the company, it's a really bad first impression.
And also, maybe you can also weigh in, and you touched on something, Kimberly, about non-confidential. And maybe you can also weigh in on sort of, maybe this is jumping ahead, but...
We hold it in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, actually, I was going to mention also, don't just say that we have to immediately go under CDA to see anything about your company, because we're just not going to. We may be contaminating some of our internal efforts if we go under CDA and then find out that you guys are working on the same fancy target that we're working on, etc. So give us enough for our scientists to get excited about. You don't have to actually tell us the target, but give us some data around it that gives it a little bit of rationale and credibility. Also, develop the relationship. We'll develop it with you, but don't think, your first email and then 3 months later we'll do a deal. I mean, that would be great. But honestly, sometimes it takes years. So you've got some early science, maybe initially let us know about your ideas, and then as you evolve, keep contacting us. The more we recognize your name and your rational behavior and the science that evolves and generates, the more we want to work with you, and we'll tell you what we're looking for. So if you want to do the next animal experiment, that will actually help us get some confidence around it. I think that's the best way to go.
There's little to add to that. With respect to confidential data, I would just say be disciplined about how you create and label your slides, right? Don't tell me over the phone that you're going to send me a non-confidential deck, and then it says confidential in the footer on all the slides. That will lead to some back and forth that is completely unnecessary. Totally agree with the mass email bombardment statement. That is not helpful, not for anyone. These organizations are typically points of convergence within large biopharmaceutical companies, meaning that irrespective of to whom you send information, it will end up in the same place, which is with these people. That's how it works. It doesn't matter if you send it to our CEO, our Chief Strategy Officer, the head of discovery, it ends up in this organization, because part of our role is to screen a very large number of opportunities. 2018, we just did the numbers. We looked at 1,400 opportunities. At the end of the day, as I said earlier in the introduction, we did 14 transactions, 14 deals, that's 1%. Right? And so that's how the entire process works. But all the information converges in the BD and search and evaluation organization, and the assessment starts there, no matter to whom you send it, no matter to how many people within the organization you send it.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point with the sharing the non-confidential information. I think the only point to add is, we're a science-led organisation, and therefore we're going to need a scientific champion within the review team to progress anything that comes through. So build a great scientific package in terms of the pharmacology, because as part of our review structure, that will be going out to the lead scientists. So, I understand we may not always be able to disclose the target, but just lead with great science, and that will spark the appetite within the company to continue the conversation. And back to Chris's point, I think there's probably a very strong link between how aggressive the emails are and who they originally go to, and then the actual success of those in licensing for us.
So, can you clarify that?
Yeah, too aggressive means that it falls to the bottom of the pile.
Okay.
Because though that review team and our review team will just keep seeing the same deck time after time, and we'll keep getting new decks in and new science, and it just keeps falling to the back of the pile. So I'd say less aggressive, but also reach out to the scientists, attend the scientific conferences, show how good your science is, how good your data package is, and that's what we'll find a champion internally that then can progress through for the confidential discussions.
One thing important to us also, and I'm sure important to others here too, is you may actually have some interesting data that's preclinical or very early in vivo data that shows a small bit of differentiation superiority to another similar mechanism that's further along, etc. And you can say potentially, it might be best in class, but you really have to give a rationale as to why that early data should actually translate in the clinic, and you would actually have a comparable and superior product in the clinic, because we're just not going to invest in kind of third to market mechanisms. They might be slightly better, but if you can't have a label that shows that they're better, then it's not an attractive offer for us.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think the problem starts even before you get a label. Right, because if you have a compound that is not clearly differentiated vis-a-vis a standard of care or a more advanced competitor molecule, how would you think about the clinical development plan for that? How would you actually prove that it is superior or non-inferior? Think about the dimensions of what type of clinical study would take to support your target product profile vis-a-vis a more advanced standard of care or competitor molecule. These are important considerations even before the FDA grants you a label.
And I just want to go back to kind of converge off the aggressive email and say, that
Not that it's a sore point for anyone.
No. Well, I guess it's something we commonly see. So, but the other is, the confidential, non-confidential package. Put your scientific hat on and say, could I review my own package non-confidentially and actually make my story and go somewhere? Because oftentimes we get so little information that we can't do anything with it. And sending it to our scientists takes their time, and there's nothing there. So be sure you find that time in development where you actually have enough that you can give us, and you can tell an awful lot non-confidentially.
Yeah, I think in conjunction with that statement, if you have a discovery stage platform or a preclinical opportunity, and there's a non-confidential deck with 10 slides, 3 are focused on the science, 7 on the commercial, multi-billion-dollar commercial potential down the road, that usually doesn't resonate with the people who have to review this, which in the first place are people from our discovery organizations, from our early development organizations. The commercial don't spend too much time highlighting that the drug will be the next Humira or Lipitor or something like that.
So Neil, you're saying that AbbVie knows the value of the markets it's in. It doesn't need that.
No, I think what I'm saying is that we don't know the value of the market. I mean, just take oncology as an example. What will you do? right? If you have a novel target, you will usually go into a first-in-human study where enrollment criteria will be fairly wide open. You will enroll patients with relapsed refractory solid tumors. You will allow patients with multiple solid tumors to enroll in the study. And that will be your signal-generating study.
Right. What you're saying is you don't need a slide deck explaining how large the cancer market is. Exactly. Yeah. So I think what you've heard a bit here is a common process that we have. Is in some ways we're gatekeepers, but we also need to engage the scientists who eventually are the champions that we'll be doing. Because we tend to be sort of jacks of all trades, masters of none. It's sort of a part of what our skill set is being able to be that first pass on the therapeutic areas that we're responsible for in our organizations, and which we're technologies. And what you heard is that we tend to cover a lot of areas. So this is why often the slide deck that we get, we often also talk in PowerPoint and executive summaries, and so that has to stand alone. If you go sort of the tech model and your slide deck has lots of pictures of Einstein and cats being, I don't know, happy, it doesn't translate well to the scientists. These have to be data-rich packages because we need to engage people. So I guess maybe this brings us to the next step then. Say that's been a good first meeting. You have scientific engagement, maybe even gotten to the point where you had a meeting with some of the scientists. But often what we see is like, this is interesting, we're not quite ready, we want to see more data. That's pretty typical. In a good case, we provide you very concrete, what we need to see as a differentiator or a next step or what that best experiment is. But maybe the panelists can say a little bit about this phase, which often will go years in a relationship, which is you've met, you're interested, and there's no deal yet. So what's productive behavior on both sides? What's led to deals? What's been killing deals?
Yeah, I'll start. I think to be open to question and answers, that is one thing. To be prepared to answer the question, which additional information could be made available without a CDA, which additional information do you have that you would be willing to share under CDA. These are good steps in preparing for next steps after the initial review of a non-confidential presentation. Usually, at least in the case of AbbVie, it will take probably 2 or 3 conference calls and WebExes with a growing number of subject matter experts that will then dive deeper into the information that you have. Usually the process with us is that 1 out of 8 opportunities that we initially assess goes ultimately under CDA. You should also be prepared for that next step. You should probably have an electronic data room that probably has 2 parts to it. One is information that you would make available as soon as a party accesses the electronic data room, and the second part being information that you want to hold back until you get to post non-binding term sheet and agreement negotiation, the most sensitive information that may not necessarily be required for the early steps of a scientific assessment.
And I think from the technology perspective, we often, if there's interest from your initial package, we'll get the right group of scientists together and try to have a call and have you walk through either that deck, a more extensive deck. And oftentimes it's non-confidential. In the technology world, we don't often need to know how things actually work. We need to see data, we need to ask questions, determine where the applications are. And so that first call could very well be non-confidential. I think one of the other things that often happens is, can we come to your site? We want to come face to face. And what I think you need to realize is speed is what's important to me. How quickly can we get a meeting together? And I have scientists around the world. And so for me, a WebEx works just as efficiently as a face-to-face. In fact, oftentimes it's a lot faster and easier. And so that is another learning, that we will be perfectly fine doing that presentation through a WebEx. But I think I have to resonate with, be sure you're prepared. Be sure I get the slides in advance of that call so my team has a chance to look at it, think about their questions. Be sure that your team, you have the right number. Oftentimes, we have more people on the company side on the phone than we have on our own. And it's going to be very interactive, and it's going to not necessarily get to any conclusion at that first meeting, but it'll get us to where we can go back in-house, talk about what we heard, figure out where the champion lies, where the next steps lies, and then get back to you.
I can just add, if you're interested, a little bit about our process as well, which is very similar. So we'll start with maybe a confidential, basically overview, presentation, WebEx, Skype, whatever it is. And we'll actually gate it, get some excitement, get a champion from R&D to explore it further. We might go into the initial data room. We don't want to see everything. We don't want to see the structure of the molecule or anything. We want to just get a little bit more confirmation data, maybe some follow-up questions. And then we actually have a monthly meeting, I'm sure it's similar across the panel, with our senior management. So the head of R&D, and we put together our own slides. So it's great if your slides are awesome, because then we can use that. And put together a presentation for head of R&D and his direct reports, head of research, head of development, et cetera, and present the data, have the champion say why this is interesting, what we should do next. We also, depending on the stage of the deal, we also have another monthly meeting with the head of commercial and talk about why this would be compelling, what are the assumptions, what is the potential value here. So this is a recurring monthly session, review session, so we can hit that all the time. We can do ad hocs too, and we just kind of keep flowing it and gating it in terms of our diligence review until we are able to execute a deal.
Yeah, it's a very simple review process in terms of, the original non-confidential TCs could be spread over approximately 2 months. We also hold meetings at least twice a month with the scientific leadership team, where we'll have a long table of everything that's active, anything that's on pause, anything that we're still waiting, for example, CDAs to come back from the company. So it's a constantly evolving list in some ways, but we will also help pitch companies. The scientists will then have their time to ask questions. And going back to what do those TCs look like? Yeah, they look like slide presentations, but I think often the companies may have 40 slides and try to present those within a 1 hour TC, and this is more just for advice. Most of the time the scientists and the team will have already read the slides, so most of that time is going to be held for Q&A rather than background data and background information on how great the technology and the therapeutic is. So just be aware that I'd say the majority of time will be taken on Q&A. And then I think that everything sounds very similar. Yeah, we probably see around 10% progress from confidential into signing a CDA. And the only other part of the JPM meetings as well is to help some companies too. We may see a data package that looks reasonable, but for example, we may be using a CRO for our in vivo pharmacology, so we may advise them that it might be suitable for them to run their particular molecule within, using the same CRO that we may use for our own preclinical models, so that we have a direct comparison. And we found that to be really helpful, because then when they come back with that data package, it's something that's directly comparable to anything that we've internally assessed using, for example, a CRO for our own preclinical animal data. But that's just a comment in terms of often some of the meetings would have been a no, but part of being here is to try to help some of the companies learn what data package are we looking for and how can we help them come back to something that the scientists will appreciate and that we can progress.
We also work very closely, we have a small ventures arm, and so there's different thresholds basically in terms of investment, in terms of overall acquisition of the opportunity versus just an equity investment. And so we actually have ventures sit in our monthly R&D technical reviews to see if they're also interested in any of these opportunities that may not be ready yet for pure licensing. So that, and then we'll let ventures know, hey, this one looks really interesting, but it's just a little bit too high risk for us right now, et cetera. So that conversation goes back and forth.
And then, I guess quickly, as we're finishing up this section here of how to introduce and stay in contact, is the cadence of, a lot of our BD group tends to use a cadence of sort of BioEurope, BIO, JP Morgan. Of course, these are all expensive meetings for small entrepreneurs to attend and go to the partnering session. Is that cadence right? How do you want to stay in touch with people? What's the most efficient way, especially for a small company, to stay in touch with you?
We, on the meeting side, we go to the scientific conferences too, and we have therapeutic area specific BD people, and so they will constantly be going to the key scientific conferences in that TA, therapeutic area. So if you're going to be at those scientific conferences, definitely reach out and ask if we're going to be there too. And then beyond that, just send an email. Tell them, you know, if we're not ready yet, you can say, hey, we're going to have this data in 6 months. Do you want me to loop back with you? And that would be great to reach out via email.
And for those of us that have a hub-based model, you know, we have a BD group out here on the West Coast. They're often in San Diego, up in Seattle, and so again, letting us know where you are, but you know, they also will make visits at times. So that's another way. And then some of your local organizations, you know, in New Jersey, we have, in Pennsylvania, we have some local licensing meetings. A lot of our smaller groups are there. And, you know, but definitely keep us in touch via email and scientific conferences.
Yeah, AbbVie is also represented at all major scientific and trade conferences in the therapeutic areas that we care most about. That's a good way to check in. That's a good way to foster the relationship. But with respect to updates on programs, really the right cadence from my point of view is whenever you have meaningful new data, especially new data that responds to previously unanswered questions that were raised by our scientists. So send us an email. The last thing we want to do is reassess the same package that we received 6 months ago, or with an insignificant update or just polished slides. We don't do that, right? We will tell you what we're looking for, and once you have that, please reach out to us and send us an update or check in with us at one of these major partnering events.
Great, thanks. Actually, I'd like to, we have a chunk of time left, about 20 minutes left, but I'd actually like to open up for questions now if there's any burning questions on the topics that we've covered so far, or something that you think would be quite relevant to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. Yes, Stephanie.
So for the panel, how do you feel about academic spin-outs, and what do you expect to see from those very early stage companies?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question?
How do you feel about academic spin-outs?
Academic spin-outs, okay. What do we expect to see?
See at that very early stage?
Okay.
I mean, we're extremely favourable for academic spin-outs. I mean, being located in Cambridge in the UK, there's a fantastic wealth of science that comes both out of Cambridge University, Oxford, London, and we help support those both in terms of funding mechanisms for those academics as they start to spin out, mentoring for PIs as they look to spin out their technologies. I'd say for us, particularly within that environment, we're fully supportive of academic spin-outs to help them with their technologies. IP sometimes becomes a challenge, but because we've been doing it for a number of years now, it's starting to get easier and there's more flexibility with the IP that comes from the academic spin-outs. But I'd say fully supportive of that.
Yeah, I'd add one point that sort of relates to the IP is we've talked to people that have ideas about their technologies or certain findings, and they recognize that it can be quite impactful, especially ideas in oncology. But they also want to make sure they get that Nature paper because they're not sure if they want to still continue on the academic track. And I think that people have to realize that, you know, if you're going to be filing IP, that's going to be buried for a while. You can't rush out and file the Nature paper. You have to commit at least one way or another on part of what you're working on. And sometimes you can, if you're talking to some smart people, you can sometimes split that up into spinning out part of the technology or asset into something to be a company and still retain some aspect of the academic research. But if it's like a new target, that's hard to do.
I would say from Merck, we certainly have many academic collaborations and relationships, but the IP is the one where I could say you get those stumbling blocks where there was a paper or the university still has some rights. So trying to understand that early on so we don't get entangled down the road is something we should definitely talk about early on.
And Kim, especially with technologies, you see often postdocs will come out with a really cool trick they can do that comes out of the academic lab, but they haven't necessarily done sort of the lean launchpad piece where they understand what the customer base is. So I don't know if you see that or can talk about that.
Yeah, you know, we see it, but I think what's great is some of our scientists just jump in and try to help understand it and find real-world applications So in some academic relationships, it's giving that guidance of here's where we want to see the technology go. It's cool for this application, but it's not something we're going to do on a routine basis. And so also establishing that kind of a dialogue with a PI and an academic has been very fruitful.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, there are two things. On the one side, there are academic collaborations, of which we have many. Those get publicly announced less frequently, I would say. Some companies, I believe J&J usually publishes about those in bundles. And that's one way of dealing with that. So that's on the one side, academic collaborations. The other one are true spin-offs. We have the capacity to seed companies concepts that come straight out of academia. Last year we did that with a company from Australia that specializes in hookworm proteins. And the year before that we did that with Charisma, a spin-off from UPenn. Those seeding companies requires a lot of work, and it's a resource sink. So we have limited capacity to do that, probably not more than one per year through our venture arm, which in totality will probably make 5 or 6 investments per year.
So sorry, I'm going to ask one more question on this topic. So what's the most common, maybe you have 2 answers, so the most common way that you interact with academic nascent companies? So maybe they have one SBI or grant. You mentioned venture is rare, but what's the most common way to interact with a partnership there? I mean, we will often do sponsored research as a de-risking and maybe a test agent. So it won't be something that's core and has a lot of IP generation, but it's more to be very closely linked to something that we could immediately transfer to a lead optimization program or a technology. That's how we tend to do it. I don't know if there's any other.
Yeah, that's similar to us as well, and we like to provide some guidance in terms of applicability to, true commercialization opportunities. So it might be very cool science. We just want to make sure that it can be applied to something that can be applicable to the market. So that we like to get involved early and collaborate with the scientists to make sure that pathway is on the right path, at least for us.
Yes, same thing here. Sponsored research agreements are one thing. On the other side, we have announced a couple of larger strategic multi-year collaborations with academic institutions that span across multiple individual projects. That's another way for us to engage with academic institutions.
Great. So thanks for the question. Why don't we go to the next question here? Sorry, in the front here.
How do you evaluate sort of enabling platform or discovery platforms versus, say, like a single asset? Like, what's the assessment differential?
So the question was how our process is for evaluating platforms as opposed to an individual asset.
I think for us, the overall process is the same in terms of getting the right scientists from our team involved and looking at the data that has been generated from the platform to date and the hypothesis and the differentiator of the platform. I think the difficulty with the challenge with platforms, but it's not a barrier, is how to value it in terms of financially. How do you actually have the market value? And so what we typically do is have hypothetical assets that get spun out of it, right? And they all have their own probability of success. And so it's just a trickier, as opposed to having one asset that has an indication and you know how it's going to sit in the market. So
yeah, ours is very similar. The valuation part will be based on a prediction of the number of assets that we could potentially gain from using that technology, but it's very open.
And I'll add to that with assets you tend to get more of a binary response because either we like it, we don't, or we're working on it already or whatever. With platform technologies, usually what we find is the right solution at the wrong time. And that's where maintaining a relationship, especially if we really believe in your scientific team and that what you're doing is differentiated, we just don't necessarily have the right problem for it. The challenge is that what we usually end up giving you is our hardest problems that we can't solve any other way. And so you're trying to validate your technology on something that is very difficult. And that's a whole separate question.
Yeah, I think that was well noted, but I think in the platforms oftentimes too, you'll see us come back with can we do some kind of a feasibility? Can we actually see what it can do? And that's very different than an asset.
And do you often bring those experiments in-house? So, I mean, what we'll do sometimes is they'll prepare the agent or the modification, and then we'll do some of the validation in-house.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Oftentimes, formulation, we may have you formulate.
Yeah.
If it's animal studies, we may choose to do those in-house or do them right up into non-human primates. So it kind of depends on the situation, but just having that flexibility to know that we've got to understand how it works with our compounds or our problem, and then figure out what that next step may look like.
So yeah, right, Lenny.
Given that the scientific piece of an asset is sound and exciting, what are the next 2 or 3 things that you look for before in evaluating them? Like, so what is the top or most weighted item on your rubrics individually?
Well, and you're talking about an asset?
Yeah.
It's easier. So if the scientific data are interesting and compelling and fit within our strategic needs, the other question is like, how easy is it to make, right? So you need to think about manufacturability and how expensive is it to make. Can you bring those costs down to make it actually a reasonable price product on the market? So I think in terms of manufacturing, that's strong. IP, obviously, how long will it have protection on the market? And then can it be applied to a broader indication, population, life cycle management, all of that kind of stuff. So it's probably 10 other things to consider there.
Yeah, we think about it the same ways. We involve the same functions like CMC and manufacturing colleagues, IP colleagues, etc. It's also important for us to envision what could an aspirational product profile look like, right? It's too early to really have what we call a target product profile, where we become very granular and specific about product attributes, like dosing, schedule, etc., right? It's too early for that if you talk about an early preclinical stage opportunity. But to think about where could it possibly reasonably end up, what could it look like 2 or 3 years down the road, and also think about how would you develop such a compound, right? Are there any specific regulatory questions you would expect? I'll give you an example. There are companies that and scientists that are very interested in quiescent tumor cells. You have to think about targeting those in a completely different way from a clinical development point of view than you would think about a tyrosine kinase inhibitor or the next checkpoint inhibitor, right? So there are many colleagues from many different functions involved in those discussions about imagining the future of what an asset could potentially look like down the road.
Yeah, the only other part here is the compatibility with internal process. So, for example, in the biologic space, if that protein is being expressed in an E. coli system, it may not be compatible with our mammalian expression of the yields that we'd expect to achieve. So those are the immediate questions in terms of the CMC package that we're going to start to address and come back to you and ask you about.
Thanks, another great question. I think we have time for one more question. I want to do a wrap up around this. So if there's another question from the audience, or we have, okay, in the back there. Yeah.
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about digital health related initiatives. How do you look at it, and what's the best way to approach? I know, for example, Bayer and many of the pharma companies have competitions online. Is that the right way to go, or is it better for us to go through the innovation arm or through the specific department where the solution has been?
I'll weigh in very briefly on that, and I think that everyone was trying to figure out how do we address digital health and digital innovation officers and all this structural chaos, at least in our company, that was actually in some ways interesting because it was very organic. People recognized it was really impactful. It comes down to what solution are you addressing, and it goes to this. And sometimes you're crossing business units, and that becomes difficult. And maybe Chris, you can talk about that. But in the end, it's maybe digital, but it's really it's a solution to a specific problem that someone in the company should have a pain point on.
Yeah, it's a really changing space for us. We know that we need to be involved with digital. There's some of the straightforward ones are reach out straight with our clinical team so that we can apply those to trials that we either are planning or are ongoing to add value to us. So let's give an example with the diabetes space in terms of continuous glucose monitoring. and the digital aspect of that can only look at the efficacy in patients, but also just look at compliance in terms of if those patients are compliant to take the medication and what the frequency, and then we can start to look at that in trial design. So at the moment, we want to get involved as much as we can with digital. It goes back to the academic spin out question too, and that is the IP is very different than a single acid therapeutic, and that in some cases is slowing down the ability to run the feasibility studies because the IP space is very different than a single acid therapeutic. And also there's a lot of big players. Some of those are in the Bay Area here. There's lots of small companies too, and we're trying to navigate that IP landscape where there might be more flexibility in younger startup companies in the digital space and perhaps less flexibility with some of the mammoths in the digital space. So we're learning.
And for us, it often comes in through my group because it touches so many areas in the early space, but it's cross-divisional. We're seeing it in clinical, we're seeing it in our informatics, and certainly IP policy. It's just so new, and getting your hands around it all is taking time.
Yeah, we have a separate group that looks at those, but they are obviously very integrated across the therapeutic area and commercial R&D. And to Chris's point, what problem are we trying to solve? And that's an internal problem because it's really hard for our internal teams to say definitively this is exactly what we need and this is how it'll be protected on the market.
So another good question, thanks very much. So I'm going to wrap up now with the lightning round, so you don't have much time, we have like 5 minutes left. So Bill Gates said that we will overestimate the amount of change in the next 2 years and underestimate the amount of change in the next 10 years. So I'm going to give you an out. What are you going to see in 5 years that's going to be impactful? So that would be totally safe. So what do you think you're going to see in 5 years that will change maybe how you're operating, how your company is working, what's exciting new technology? Give you a pretty open area here. And I'll start so that Niels can think for a second. So I'm very bullish on this area of anti-aging therapies. I think this is an emerging area that's coming out of the space of being 20-somethings trying to live forever and actually real science that has impact in actually mammalian systems. And you're starting to see real business models with real clinical programs around these approaches. So anyone else go for it?
No, I'll just say it was my idea to say something that I think is good.
Look, I think with a 5-year time horizon, I think actually we're going to see a few things change, but many of the things that will have an impact over the next 5 years, given the time it takes to develop new drugs and new solutions outside of digital, which has faster cycles, it still takes a long time. I mean, the fastest, the 2 drugs we have on the market for hematologic malignancies, Venclexta and Imbruvica, it took roughly 5 years from first patient in the first clinical study to first submission for regulatory approval. That's fast. I think Tufts University publishes that it still takes on average 11, 12, or 13 years to develop a new drug. So with that said, 5 years from now, you'll see several of the things that are now preclinical, somewhere in mid-stage clinical development, and you'll see some products with breakthrough therapy potential actually hit the market. Outside of that, I think we will see increasing integration of artificial intelligence in multiple different ways, in multiple different functional areas. But I think we'll not see human intelligence and the importance contributions from that go away within the next 5 years.
One thing that'll be interesting is we will have another presidential election. No more said on that. But I think I'm watching the gene therapy / cell therapy space. These are new modalities, and I don't know honestly how much progression is really going to be made in 5 years, but I think those areas have theoretical promise, but the application to broader populations, etc., still is not yet tangible. And also in terms of the manufacturing and the durability and all that. So we'll just get more information on those areas, which will be very interesting.
And from a technology perspective, I really think the AI, machine learning, and where is that going to impact and speed things along, find new insights that maybe we didn't expect. That all coupled with this digital digital health and how we totally recruit patients and run our trials, I think in 5 years we'll see changes from those two areas.
So maybe just to piggyback on Jessica's point with regards to the cell and gene therapy, the major area that I see...
I'm going to talk about the president.
UK-based, I'm going to avoid that. We have our own problems. No, but the cell-based and gene-based therapy, because what I see as being disruptive, and we do in the business, is we're particularly within MedImmune in terms of antibody production, we're looking at large-scale expression purification. In the next 5, possibly even 10 years, that's going to change. And what we term that under an umbrella of in vivo express biologics, and that is if we use, as an example, may not be using this method, but viral vectors to deliver that particular antibody so that our own body cells, tissues secrete that antibody, which could have a duration, for example, of 6 months secretion, depending on the vectors that we use. That circumvents the need to have large-scale expression, purification, manufacturing, and that will disrupt our business, so that we want to look at technologies that will enable us to get to expression within our own bodies of, for example, antibodies or peptide-based therapeutics. That's something that I see in the next 5, possibly even beyond that, years, that will disrupt our standard business and development.
So you heard it here first at Renzi. We'll have a presidential election. Human intelligence will not be replaced.
Brexit will still be discussed.
But we'll be using AI to find better partnerships in cell and gene disruptive therapies. All right, thanks very much, and enjoy your conference.